We're dedicating this session to a full analysis of the years 2000 through 2009 in the film industry. It's a decade that I think is often just remembered for its big, blockbuster franchises.
Yeah.
But when you actually start to look at the records, it represents something much more, a fundamental restructuring of how movies get made, how they're marketed, and ultimately how we consume them.
It really is a decade of infrastructure building.
Infrastructure, that's a great way to put it.
If you think about the 1990s as a period of experimentation with new digital tools, then the 2000s were all about the standardization of those tools. The data we have, the box office trends, the critical reception, production methods, it all just paints this picture of an industry in a period of really rapid transition.
Okay, so we're going to break all of this down systematically. We'll look at the technology, the business strategies, the shifts in genre, and then get into the hard data, the financials, and the critical legacy. And I want to start with the most visible change, which has to be the technology. You just cannot talk about the 2000s without talking about the computer.
No, you can't. The computer moved from being just a post-production tool for a few specific effects to being absolutely central to the entire filmmaking process from start to finish.
It's pretty interesting when you compare where the decade started to where it ended. In the year 2000, we had films using digital effects, but a lot of the time they were designed to be invisible. We've talked about the film Castaway before in this context. You have Tom Hanks on an island. To the average viewer, that just looks like a great location shoot. But the reality of that production was so heavily reliant on digital erasing.
That is a prime example of what the industry calls invisible effects work. In Castaway, they used digital compositing to remove any signs of civilization from the background shots. They even erased footprints in the sand to maintain continuity from take to take.
Just tiny details you'd never notice.
Exactly. The whole goal was to enhance that feeling of total isolation. The technology was used to subtract parts of reality, not necessarily to add fantasy.
Okay, so contrast that with something like the Matrix sequels, Reloaded and Revolutions, which came out in 2003. That was the complete other side of the coin. That was not about hiding the computer at all. It was about showing you something a physical camera could never, ever capture.
Right.
The burly brawl scene in Reloaded, where Neo fights 100 copies of Agent Smith, that was a benchmark.
It was. For that sequence, they essentially had to invent new technology. They developed a process called universal capture, or UCAP.
What did that actually involve?
It was a way to capture the actor's performance and all the texture data, their skin, their clothes, to create a completely photoreal digital human, a digital double. And that allowed for camera movements and action choreography that just completely defied the laws of physics.
And even though, you could look back now and say the visuals have aged a little.
Sure, technology always improves.
But the methodology they established, that pipeline, became the standard for modern digital action sequences. It just scaled up the ambition of what a blockbuster could even attempt to show an audience.
It did.
And this scaling up, it wasn't just limited to live action, was it? The 2000s effectively killed traditional 2D, hand-drawn animation in the American feature film market.
It did.
If you grew up on the Disney Renaissance of the 90s, The Lion King, Aladdin, that was the art form. By the mid-2000s, it had basically vanished from the major studios.
The shift was incredibly rapid and really absolute. The main catalyst was just the commercial performance. Computer-generated imagery, or CGI films, were making so much more money than the traditional 2D films.
And the pivotal moment was Shrek.
Absolutely. The release of Shrek in 2001, not only was it a massive financial success for DreamWorks Animation, but it also won the very first Academy Award for Best Animated Feature.
Right, they created a new category that year.
They did, and that win signaled to the entire industry that CGI wasn't just some novelty, it was going to be the new standard, the future.
And DreamWorks really did become the animation powerhouse of this decade, didn't they? You had Shrek, then Shrek 2, which was even bigger, Madagascar, Kung Fu Panda. They were just pumping out these massive hits using this 3D style.
They certainly were. And of course, Pixar was operating at an incredibly high level throughout this entire period as well.
Of course.
But there is another major player that sort of emerged from the ashes of a failure. And we need to talk about 20th Century Fox.
Okay.
This is a really significant piece of business history. Fox had its own animation studio, Fox Animation Studios, and they were trying to compete with Disney in that traditional hand-drawn space. But they suffered a severe financial failure with a film called Titan AE in 2000.
I remember that film. It was a big sci-fi epic.
A very ambitious one, but it didn't connect with audiences and the financial losses were huge. As a result, Fox Animation Studios was closed on October 31st, 2000.
Wow, that's decisive.
It was. And that closure forced the studio to pivot its resources. They shifted their entire animation focus to a smaller computer graphics house they had acquired called Blue Sky Studios.
And that led to Ice Age.
That decision directly resulted in the Ice Age franchise, which went on to become one of the most lucrative animated properties of the entire decade.
So it's a clear example of the market just dictating the art form. The audience stopped showing up for hand-drawn films in large numbers, so the studios just stopped making them.
Precisely.
But, it wasn't just a binary choice between hand-drawn and that kind of Pixar-style CGI. There were other things happening. There were some directors trying to find a middle ground. Robert Zemeckis spent a huge part of this decade obsessed with motion capture.
Zemeckis pushed very hard for a technique that he called performance capture. You see it in films like The Polar Express, Beowulf, and his version of A Christmas Carol. The idea was to create these fully digital environments populated by digital characters.
But driven by human actors.
Exactly. Driven directly by the movements and facial expressions of human actors. Now, this era of experimentation was pretty controversial. People talked a lot about the uncanny valley effect.
Yeah, that term was everywhere back then.
The characters looked realistic enough to be unsettling, but not quite realistic enough to be truly convincing. There was an artificiality to them that some audiences found off-putting.
It is interesting, though, that while American 2D animation was essentially dying out, Japanese hand-drawn animation anime was having its biggest cultural moment ever in the West. This is the decade where Hayao Miyazaki basically became a household name globally.
Spirited Away, released in 2001, is the key title there. It's a landmark film. It won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, which remains the only time a hand-drawn, non-English language film has ever won that award.
An incredible achievement.
It is, and along with his other films from that period, like Howl's Moving Castle and Ponyo, they proved that there was still a very robust artistic and commercial path for traditional techniques as long as they offered a unique narrative experience that audiences couldn't get elsewhere.
And we even saw stop motion holding on, which is maybe the most niche, labor-intensive art form there is.
It is, but it had a very strong decade. You had Aardman Animations in the UK with Chicken Run and Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit.
Both of which won Oscars.
They did. And then you had the American studio Laika emerging toward the end of the decade with Coraline, which was also a huge critical and commercial success.
In fact, Chicken Run, which came out right at the start of the decade in 2000, it still remains the highest-grossing stop-motion animated film of all time.
That's correct. It just demonstrates that the medium itself was never the barrier to entry for audiences. It was always the content, the story that was the deciding factor.
Okay, let's shift our focus a little bit. Let's move from the technology to the business strategy of the major studios. Because if technology defined the look of the 2000s, then I think a phrase like risk aversion really defined the business model.
That's very accurate.
This is the decade where that mid-budget movie really began to disappear. And the studio tentpole strategy just completely took over. The mandate from the top was crystal clear.
Yeah.
Don't bet on new ideas. Bet on things people already know.
The economic logic behind it is rooted in the rising costs of both production and, maybe even more importantly, marketing.
Right. Marketing budgets were exploding.
They were. So to justify spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a single film, studios felt they needed a guarantee of a built-in audience. And this led directly to a strategy of exploiting existing intellectual property, or IP.
And that's when we see this sharp increase in sequels, prequels, reboots, remakes, adaptations, all of it.
Every form of brand extension you can imagine.
The reliance on nostalgia was just staggering. When you look at the slate of films released between 2000 and 2009, it really feels like the studios were just raiding the television archives of the 1970s and 80s.
They were looking for any property with name recognition.
Just anything. The list is huge.
The list of properties revived during this period is extensive, yes. We saw a wave of television adaptations. You had Charlie's Angels.
Right.
Starsky and Hutch, The Dukes of Hazzard, Miami Vice, Get Smart.
And then the cartoon adaptations. Scooby-Doo.
Scooby-Doo, Transformers, G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra, Alvin and the Chipmunks, even something as niche as Speed Racer.
It wasn't just adaptations of other media, though. It was also about resurrecting dormant film franchises. It's like no franchise was allowed to stay finished. We got Terminator 3. We got a fourth Rambo film.
A fourth Die Hard with Live Free or Die Hard.
Rocky Balboa. They brought Rocky back. Even Indiana Jones came back after nearly 20 years for Kingdom of the Crystal Skull.
And beyond that, we saw the rise of the crossover event, which really treats characters as assets to be combined for maximum effect.
You mean like Freddy versus Jason?
Exactly. Freddy vs. Jason and Alien vs. Predator are the two prime examples from the decade. These films were pitched entirely on the premise of the title alone. The whole objective was to merge two separate fan bases to maximize that opening weekend box office number.
I think the most telling statistic, the one that really drives this whole point home, comes from looking at the highest grossing films of the decade. We have the top 50 list. How many of the top 50 were actually original ideas?
Out of the 50 highest grossing films of the decade worldwide, only 9 were original properties.
Only 9.
Out of 50. That means 41 of the top 50 films were based on something else. There were sequels, adaptations of books or comics, remakes.
That is just a stark representation of the industry's landscape at the time.
It is. And to add even more context to that number,
Go on.
6 of those 9 original films were animated features. Titles like Finding Nemo, Up, Ratatouille, Wall-E, also Hancock and one other big one.
So if you take animation out of the equation,
the number of original live-action blockbusters becomes vanishingly small. In fact, if you remove animation, you're basically left with just one major outlier.
And that would be Avatar.
Avatar, which came at the very end of 2009, was a true original property that became the top-grossing film of all time. But it was a huge statistical anomaly.
Okay, so since we're talking about all these franchises, we have to talk about the genres that fueled them. And for the 2000s, that conversation has to start with fantasy. It was the golden age of fantasy films.
Absolutely.
Before this decade, high fantasy was often considered box office poison, or at best it was sort of B-movie material. And then, almost overnight, it was the biggest thing on the planet.
The perception of the genre changed instantly, and it changed because of 2 films released in the same year, 2001, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.
And the numbers are just incredible. The fantasy genre provided the annual top-grossing film. What was it? 7 times in a row during the decade?
7 times in a row. That is an amazing level of consistency.
You just have this incredible run. It was Lord of the Rings, then Harry Potter, and then Pirates of the Caribbean took the baton for a few years.
And you have to remember the Star Wars prequel trilogy was also running concurrently through the first half of the decade.
Right, which is science fantasy, but it fits the mold.
And you also had The Chronicles of Narnia performing extremely well. The audience became conditioned to expect a massive world-building event film every single holiday season, and the studios were actively, desperately hunting for the next big book series to adapt into a trilogy or more.
And running right alongside fantasy, we saw the maturing of the superhero genre. In the 90s, superhero movies were often kind of campy or just outright disasters. But then in 2000, X-Men came out.
X-Men really grounded the genre. It was a conscious choice by the filmmakers to strip away the bright, colorful costumes from the comics in favor of black leather and to adopt a much more serious tone.
It treated its source material seriously.
It did. And then, just 2 years later, in 2002, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man proved that a brighter, more comic-accurate adaptation could absolutely shatter opening weekend records.
So you had 2 successful models right away.
Exactly. And the genre just kept evolving throughout the decade. By 2008, with the release of The Dark Knight, the genre had garnered a level of critical acclaim that really rivaled serious crime dramas.
The Dark Knight is such a pivotal moment. It wasn't just seen as a great comic book movie. Critics and audiences treated it like a great crime saga, like a Michael Mann film.
It did.
It proved that you could apply real, serious filmmaking prestige to intellectual property involving capes and masks.
And we also saw the revival of other genres that had been considered, well, dead.
Like the historical epic.
Ridley Scott's Gladiator, released right in 2000, was the catalyst there. It single-handedly revived the swords and sandals genre.
And that led to films like Troy, Kingdom of Heaven, 300.
And in a similar way, the musical saw a major resurgence.
Right.
Baz Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge in 2001, which had this very modern, almost Bollywood-inspired energy. And then Chicago in 2002, which went on to win Best Picture. These were genres that had been dormant for decades.
I want to touch on the action genre specifically for a moment because the actual style of fighting changed dramatically in the 2000s.
Yeah.
We saw this really heavy influence from Hong Kong cinema start to permeate Hollywood.
Yes, the integration of Hong Kong action aesthetics was widespread. It had started in the late 90s with The Matrix, but it exploded in the 2000s. Fight choreographers like the legendary Yuan Wu-ping were brought over to work on huge American films. He did the Matrix sequels, but also Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill.
And that popularized wire fu.
It popularized wire fu, where characters perform these incredible gravity-defying stunts using hidden wire work. And it shifted Hollywood action away from the kind of muscle-bound brawlers of the 80s and 90s towards these highly choreographed, almost balletic, martial arts-influenced sequences.
You also saw the rise of gun fu.
Yes, popularized by director John Woo, who also came to Hollywood. You see it in films like Mission Impossible, too. It treats gunplay almost like a form of dance, with stylized poses and acrobatic movements.
This kind of cross-pollination of styles is a good segue into the broader globalization of cinema, because the 2000s also saw American audiences becoming much more open to subtitle films than they ever had been before.
The barrier to entry for non-English language films seemed to lower significantly during this decade. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is the standout example, of course, a Mandarin-language martial arts film that earned over $128 million in the U.S. alone, an astonishing figure.
Just unheard of at the time.
But you also had other successes. Zhang Yimou's Hero, Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, even Amélie from France found a substantial Western audience.
And you have to include Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ.
Yes.
That was a film entirely in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew, no English whatsoever.
And it remains one of the highest-grossing R-rated films of all time in the United States. It proved, in a very dramatic way, that language was not a barrier if the event nature of the film was strong enough to draw people in.
We also, and this was another surprise, saw documentaries becoming blockbusters. You had Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11. You had March of the Penguins, Super Size Me. These were films that people were actually going to the movie theater to see in huge numbers.
Fahrenheit 9/11 grossed over $100 million domestically. That figure is still almost unheard of for a political documentary.
It's incredible.
And March of the Penguins became a genuine pop culture phenomenon. It seemed to suggest that audiences were actually seeking out reality-based narratives, perhaps as a counterbalance to the heavy output of fantasy and franchise films.
Okay, I want to dive into the hard data now. We've talked about the trends, but let's look at the scoreboard. We have the list of the top grossing films worldwide for the entire decade. Let's start at the top. Who took the #1 spot?
The highest grossing film of the decade, by a very wide margin, was Avatar, released in December of 2009. It grossed over $2.9 billion worldwide.
That number is it's still staggering to hear. $2.9 billion.
To put that figure in perspective, the #2 film on the list for the decade was The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. That film grossed about $1.1 billion.
Wow.
The gap between #1 and #2 was nearly $1.8 billion. Avatar was in a league entirely of its own.
It's amazing that the decade literally ends with this massive, massive outlier. It just resets the scale completely. So who rounded out the top 5 after Avatar and Return of the King?
#3 was Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest with just over $1 billion. #4 was The Dark Knight, also just over $1 billion. And #5 was the first Harry Potter film, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, with around $975 million.
So it's notable that Harry Potter launched right at the start in 2001 and landed in the top 5, while Avatar launched at the very end in 2009 and took the top spot. The bookends of the decade were extremely strong financially.
They were. And if we look at the density of hits across the years, the data shows that 2007 and 2008 were the peak years.
How so?
Each of those years, 2007 and 2008, placed 8 different films into the top 50 highest-grossing list for the entire decade.
2007, I remember that was the year of the threequel, as they called it. We had Spider-Man 3, Shrek the Third, Pirates of the Caribbean at World End. It was just a massive year for volume from these established series.
It was. And then 2008 followed up with The Dark Knight, Indiana Jones, and The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Kung Fu Panda, and the surprise smash hit, Mamma Mia.
Okay, let's look at franchise consistency within that top 50 list. We mentioned Harry Potter. How many of those films made the list?
5 of the Harry Potter films released in the decade made the top 50 list. Order of the Phoenix was at #7, Half-Blood Prince at 8, Goblet of Fire at 11, Chamber of Secrets at 14, and Prisoner of Azkaban at #21.
That is just remarkable consistency, an incredible financial engine for Warner Brothers. And what about Lord of the Rings?
All 3 of Peter Jackson's films are in the top 15. Return of the King at #2, The Two Towers at #9, and The Fellowship of the Ring at #15.
And Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy.
All 3 films are in the top 23.
It really just emphasizes the point about risk aversion. If you had a successful brand, the audience loyalty was incredibly high. People just showed up for every single installment.
It reduced the volatility of the studio's earnings. A studio executive once said that if you have a Harry Potter film on the schedule, you can predict your fourth quarter earnings with a very high degree of accuracy.
A guaranteed hit.
And that is exactly why the franchise model became so pervasive.
Okay, so now we have to address the disconnect. The divide between what made all the money and what was considered, good. We so often see this divide between the box office and the critics. We have data from Metacritic, which aggregated dozens of best-of-the-decade lists from various critics and publications. What were the films that defined the critical conversation?
The most acclaimed film of the decade, the one appearing on the most top 10 lists, was Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood.
A masterpiece.
Yeah.
But not exactly a blockbuster.
No. It was widely seen by critics as a monumental piece of American filmmaking.
And what came in at number 2?
Number 2 was Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Ah, that's a fascinating one. Because it uses science fiction elements, but it's really a very intimate character drama. And it's a film that has really, really endured in the public consciousness.
It has. Number 3 on that consensus list was David Lynch's Mulholland Drive.
Another film that people still endlessly analyze.
Number 4 was the Coen brothers' No Country for Old Men. And rounding out the top 5 was The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King.
So there it is. Return of the King is the bridge. It's the only film to appear in the top 5 of the worldwide box office list and also in the top 5 of the critical consensus list.
That is correct. It represents that rare, almost perfect alignment of popular culture and what is considered high art.
Metacritic also tracks the highest average review scores for films. How does that list differ from the best of the decade lists?
The list of highest raw scores is a bit different and more international. The film with the highest average score for the decade was Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth.
A Spanish-language dark fantasy.
Exactly. Number 2 was a Romanian film called 4 Months, 3 Weeks, and 2 Days.
A very tough but brilliant film.
Yes. Number 3 was Pixar's Ratatouille. Number 4 was Hayao Miyazaki's Spirited Away. And number 5 was Catherine Bigelow's The Hurt Locker.
That list is fascinating. It's much more international, and it includes 2 animated films right there at the top.
It really shows that critics were looking far beyond the Hollywood blockbuster for true artistic merit. And it also highlights the strength of the animation medium in the 2000s. Critics treated films like Ratatouille and Spirited Away with the same seriousness as they would any live-action drama.
I think it's also interesting to look at a few specific publications to see how tastes can vary. For example, the BBC conducted a huge poll of international critics.
Yes, they did. And their poll placed Mulholland Drive at number 1 for the decade. Their list is very auteur-driven. It's followed by Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love, and then There Will Be Blood.
And what about a major American newspaper, like the New York Times?
Their film critics also selected There Will Be Blood as the number 1 film of the decade. Their list also included Clint Eastwood's $1 Million Baby at number 3, which is a film that was massive at the time, but has perhaps faded a little from the critical conversation since.
And then you have a site like MoviePhone, which probably represents a more populist but still informed point of view.
Their selection was Kill Bill, Volumes 1 and 2, as the number 1 movie of the decade.
Which is a choice you would be very unlikely to see on a highbrow critics list, but it absolutely reflects the massive cultural impact of Tarantino's work during that period.
They also placed The Dark Knight in their top 5, which makes sense for that kind of outlet.
Speaking of Tarantino, he actually released his own personal list of his favorite films from the decade. And as a true student of cinema, his picks are always interesting.
They are. His number 1 film of the 2000s was Battle Royale,
The Japanese thriller.
the Japanese thriller from 2000 that many see as a precursor to things like The Hunger Games.
Yeah.
His list was very eclectic. It included the puppet comedy Team America, World Police, the Woody Allen film Anything Else, and the great Korean monster movie The Host.
Team America is a surprising pick from him, but it does fit his provocative style. Okay, so finally, let's look at the industry's own awards. The Academy Awards. The Oscars tell their own story about what Hollywood wanted to reward each year.
The trajectory of the Best Picture winners is very telling. We start the decade in 2000 with Gladiator, a huge-budget, old-fashioned spectacle.
The epic is back.
Exactly. Then in 2001, we get A Beautiful Mind, a very traditional biopic. In 2002, Chicago wins, and the musical is back.
And then 2003, the big one, the clean sweep.
The Lord of the Rings. The Return of the King. It won all 11 Oscars it was nominated for, tying the all-time record held by Ben-Hur and Titanic. It was really the Academy acknowledging the sheer unprecedented scale of that achievement.
After that, though, we see a shift back toward smaller, often grittier films.
We do. 2004 was Million Dollar Baby. 2005 was the controversial win for Crash. 2006 was Martin Scorsese's The Departed.
The Departed felt like a Lifetime Achievement Award for Scorsese in some ways, but it was also just a great, popular crime thriller.
It was. Then 2007 was No Country for Old Men. 2008 was the international sensation Slumdog Millionaire. And the decade closes with the 2009 winner, The Hurt Locker.
And that 2009 win for The Hurt Locker is just the perfect counterpoint to Avatar, isn't it? You had the biggest movie in history, a film that redefined the use of technology, and it lost Best Picture to a low-budget, intensely realistic drama about a bomb disposal unit in Iraq.
It highlights the recurring theme of the decade, which is really the bifurcation of cinema, the splitting into two paths. On one side, you have the massive global digital franchise machine represented by Avatar, Transformers, Pirates of the Caribbean, and on the other side, you have the critical darlings like The Hurt Locker and No Country for Old Men that are operating on a completely different scale for a different audience with different goals.
So as we wrap up this analysis, how do we summarize the 2000s? It really feels like the decade where the movies started to become content.
Yeah.
We moved away from standalone stories and toward interconnected universes. We moved from shooting on film stock to capturing on hard drives.
I think it was a decade of rapid acceleration. The industry essentially built the entire infrastructure for the modern blockbuster as we know it today. The reliance on CGI, the global-first marketing strategies, the franchise-first mentality, all of these things were standardized during these 10 years. If you look at the top films being released now, they are the direct descendants of the business models that were established between 2000 and 2009.
It was the era that gave us Gollum and Captain Jack Sparrow and Christian Bale's Batman. It brought us the animation revolution and opened the door for global storytelling to reach mainstream audiences. It was a truly transformative 10 years that changed the way we watch movies forever. We appreciate you joining us for this exploration of the data.
It was a very productive discussion.
Thanks for listening.